The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and makes you grateful for the warmth of a roaring fire. I had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Winter had finally settled in, and I had spent hours meticulously stacking firewood in my backyard, preparing for the season. The scent of fresh pine lingered in the air, and the satisfaction of knowing I was ready for the cold months ahead filled me with a quiet pride. But as I stepped outside that morning, my heart sank. The neatly stacked firewood was gone. Every single log. The space where it had been was empty, save for a few scattered splinters. My first thought was disbelief. Had I miscalculated? Maybe I hadn't stacked as much as I thought. But no. Just yesterday, I had spent an hour arranging it perfectly, ensuring it was dry and ready for use. Someone had taken it. Not just a few pieces, my entire supply had vanished. Annoyance quickly turned to suspicion. I stomped back inside and pulled up the footage from my security camera. If some desperate raccoon had developed a taste for firewood, I wanted to see it for myself. But what I saw on the screen was far worse. There she was, Margaret, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, HOA. The woman who made it her mission to control every aspect of our neighborhood. She wasn't even trying to be sneaky. Wearing her ever-present smug expression, she strutted up to my firewood pile in broad daylight, barking orders at some clueless neighbor who had the misfortune of crossing her path. With a grand wave of her hand, she gestured for 2 hired movers to haul my wood into the back of a pickup truck. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around in guilt or hesitation. She simply took it. I felt a mixture of disbelief and fury settle into my bones. She hadn't even tried to hide it. No note, no explanation, no warning. She had just decided on her own that my firewood now belonged to the HOA. And the worst part? I already knew exactly what her excuse would be. She would claim it was some kind of violation, that my firewood wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough for her high standards, or maybe she'd say it was a fire hazard, despite the fact that plenty of people in the neighborhood had the exact same setup. But none of that mattered. Margaret made the rules, and Margaret decided when to break them. Fueled by indignation, I stormed down the street straight to her house. She had, of course, decorated it to look like the HOA headquarters, complete with an unnecessary American flag display and a mailbox so pristine it looked like it had been polished that morning. I barely had to knock before she swung the door open, already looking irritated, as if she had expected my visit and considered it an inconvenience. Before I could even get a word out, she put on her fake customer service smile. "Oh, Daniel. Good morning. What a surprise. What can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining why you stole my firewood," I said, crossing my arms. She had the audacity to scoff. "Stole? Daniel, that's a rather strong word, don't you think? I merely repurposed it for the good of the community." I narrowed my eyes. "Repurposed it? Margaret, that was my firewood. I paid for it. I stacked it. And now it's gone." Margaret tilted her head, as if she were speaking to a particularly slow child. "Daniel, you know as well as I do that the HOA has certain standards. Your firewood was unsightly. It was stacked in a way that, frankly, did not match the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I was doing you a favor by removing it." I gritted my teeth. "Margaret, it was stacked in my backyard. Nobody could even see it." She waved a dismissive hand. "That's not the point. The HOA's annual bonfire is coming up, and we needed extra firewood. Your pile was the closest and most convenient." I let out a humorless laugh. "So you're telling me you just helped yourself to my firewood because it was convenient for you?" Margaret sighed, clearly already bored with this conversation. "Oh, Daniel, it's just firewood. I don't see why you're making such a fuss. You can always get more." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Margaret had a way of making everyone feel like they were the crazy ones, like their perfectly reasonable anger was irrational. But I wasn't going to let her gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. "Fine," I said, stepping back. "If you want to play it that way, Margaret, go ahead. Enjoy my firewood. But just know that you've made a huge mistake." Margaret gave a condescending laugh. "Oh, Daniel, you're always so dramatic. It's just firewood." I turned and walked away, already formulating my next move. Margaret had been running this neighborhood like her own personal kingdom for years, bullying people into following her arbitrary rules. But this time, she had messed with the wrong person. She had taken from me, not just out of greed, but out of entitlement, believing there would be no consequences. I went straight to my garage, an idea forming in my head so brilliantly devious that I almost laughed out loud. Margaret thought she could take what she wanted without repercussions? Well, I was about to show her just how wrong she was. My hands worked quickly as I dug through my supplies, pulling out the perfect components for my plan. A few hollowed-out logs, a bag of fire ants, tiny creatures with a bite that could make even the toughest person cry, and just enough patience to wait for the perfect moment. Margaret had unknowingly declared war, and I had just the perfect way to strike back. I sat in my garage, staring at the hollow logs I had carefully prepared, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction brewing inside me. If Margaret wanted to take my firewood without asking, then I would make sure she got exactly what she deserved. There was something poetic about it. She had taken from me under the pretense of community betterment, but now she was about to unknowingly sabotage herself. I reached for the small container beside me, carefully lifting the lid just enough to confirm that my tiny army was still active. The fire ants inside swarmed angrily, their little bodies twitching with energy, completely unaware that they were about to become an essential part of my revenge. I had spent hours making sure the plan would work perfectly. The logs looked just like the ones Margaret had stolen. Same size, same cut, same natural imperfections. But these were different. Each log had been hollowed out, with small entry points carved just deep enough to allow the ants to nest inside. I had tested a few to make sure they wouldn't escape until they were exposed to the heat of the fire. As soon as the logs started to burn, the ants would panic, swarming in every direction. And that was when the real fun would begin. The vision played out in my mind like a masterpiece. Margaret, standing in front of the whole neighborhood, smug as ever, tossing my generous contribution into the flames, completely unaware of what was coming next. I stacked the logs neatly in a pile near the side of my garage, making it look as though I had simply gone out and replaced my stolen firewood. Margaret was predictable, and I knew that the moment she saw fresh logs on my property, she wouldn't be able to resist helping herself again. It was a power thing with her. It wasn't about the firewood. It was about proving she could take what she wanted whenever she wanted. She had done it before, and she would do it again. And when she did, I would be ready. The next morning, I barely had to wait. Just as I was finishing my coffee, I glanced out the window and saw her standing at the edge of my yard, hands on her hips, her signature scowl locked onto my neatly stacked logs. She didn't even hesitate. With the same audacity as before, she marched over, waving for her hired movers, directing them to load the wood into her truck as if she were conducting a symphony. I could hear her self-important voice even from inside my house, barking orders about how this was necessary for the HOA event. I leaned back, smiling to myself as they drove away. Everything was set. Now, all I had to do was wait. That evening, the neighborhood gathered at the HOA's annual bonfire event. Margaret, as expected, stood front and center, basking in the attention of the residents. She had a microphone in hand, her voice ringing through the crowd as she went on and on about bringing the community together and sacrificing her own time to ensure a wonderful event for everyone. She was soaking up the admiration like a sponge, unaware that her moment of triumph was about to become her moment of humiliation. The fire pit crackled with warmth as people gathered around, sipping hot cider and chatting. Margaret, in her typical fashion, insisted on having the honor of throwing in the first log. She made a dramatic show of picking up one of the hollowed logs, holding it above her head like it was some kind of ceremonial offering, then tossed it into the flames with a flourish. The crowd cheered. The wood caught quickly, and for a brief moment, everything was normal. Then the ants woke up. At first, it was just a few tiny, confused creatures, disoriented by the sudden heat, crawling their way out of the log in search of escape. But within seconds, it was an absolute swarm. Dozens turned to hundreds, then to thousands, all fleeing the flames in pure survival mode. The fire pit exploded into chaos as ants poured out in every direction, landing on shoes, crawling up legs, and biting anything in their path. The screams started small but quickly escalated as the full force of the infestation hit the crowd. Margaret, standing closest to the fire, was the first victim. She let out an ear-piercing shriek, swatting wildly at her arms as ants crawled up her sleeves, down her back, and into her hair. She stumbled backward, crashing into the refreshments table, knocking over a massive bowl of cider, which spilled all over her clothes, soaking her just as the ants really started to bite. The panic spread like wildfire. People jumped from their seats, toppling chairs, knocking over tables, tripping over one another in their desperate attempt to escape the growing wave of ants. Someone knocked over a plate of marshmallows, which promptly stuck to Margaret's cider-soaked clothes, turning her into a human sticky trap for the frenzied insects. She thrashed and spun in circles, screaming about fire hazards and bioterrorism, while the entire neighborhood looked on in shock. The HOA vice president, an elderly woman named Beatrice, was the first to regain her composure. "Somebody help her," she shouted. But nobody was brave enough to get close. Margaret, still flailing, tripped over a fallen chair and landed face-first into the remains of the marshmallow station. When she sat up, her face was plastered with melted marshmallow, her hair a tangled mess of sugar and fire ants. The scene was so ridiculous, so utterly perfect, that I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The ants were still going strong, and Margaret, realizing she was getting no immediate help, made the only decision she could. She ran. She sprinted past the crowd, through the park, and straight into the lake at the edge of the event space. With an unceremonious splash, she threw herself into the water, emerging seconds later, gasping and flailing, her carefully styled hair now dripping over her face like a defeated sea monster. The neighborhood stood frozen, watching in stunned silence. Then, slowly, the first chuckle started. They spread like ripples in a pond until the entire gathering was shaking with laughter. Even Beatrice, still clutching her clipboard, was doubled over, tears streaming down her face. Margaret, humiliated, crawled out of the water, her once perfect image now in shambles. She stomped toward her car, soaking wet, covered in marshmallow, her pride in absolute ruins. She didn't bother making a speech, didn't try to regain control of the night. She just got into her car, slammed the door, and drove off into the darkness, leaving behind a bonfire event that would be talked about for years to come. I stood near the back of the crowd, sipping my cider, enjoying every second of it. Margaret had finally faced the consequences of her entitlement, and the best part? She had done it to herself. As I turned to leave, a few neighbors caught my eye, giving me knowing looks. They didn't say anything, but their smirks said enough. They knew. They knew I had something to do with this, but none of them would ever say a word. The night was a triumph, and as I walked home, listening to the distant echoes of laughter, I knew one thing for sure. Margaret's reign of terror was officially over. The aftermath of the bonfire disaster spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the time I woke up the next morning, the entire street was buzzing with whispers. Texts were flying, and a few neighbors were still laughing about the sight of Margaret running into the lake, covered in marshmallow and fire ants. It was the kind of event people would talk about for years, the story morphing and growing with every retelling. Some claimed Margaret had screamed so loudly that she startled every dog within a 5-mile radius. Others said she had swallowed a marshmallow whole while flailing and nearly choked. Every version got a little more ridiculous, and I was more than happy to let the legend of Margaret grow. Margaret, however, was nowhere to be seen. Her house, which was usually a hive of self-important activity, stood eerily quiet. No early morning HOA notices taped to people's doors, no passive-aggressive emails about trash bins being left out for too long. It was as if the queen had abandoned her throne. I figured she was licking her wounds, plotting her next power move, trying to find a way to spin the story so that she wasn't the villain. That was Margaret's way. She never admitted defeat, never backed down, no matter how obvious it was that she had lost. By the afternoon, the first official sign of Margaret's attempt at damage control appeared in the form of an email. The subject line read, "Urgent, HOA meeting attendance mandatory." The wording was as dramatic as ever, full of phrases like gross misconduct, serious safety violations, and threats to neighborhood stability. It was clear she intended to frame herself as the victim, to convince everyone that the bonfire disaster had been an act of sabotage against her personally. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. The meeting was held in the community center, and by the time I arrived, the room was packed. People were crammed into chairs, standing along the walls, all murmuring amongst themselves. A few turned and gave me knowing smirks as I walked in, their eyes twinkling with barely contained amusement. Margaret was already seated at the front, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. Gone was her usual prim and proper composure. Her hair was still a little frizzy from its unfortunate dip in the lake, and her expression was tight with frustration. She was trying to maintain control, but she had lost something important the night before, her authority. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain her usual air of superiority. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice a little too sharp, a little too forced. "We have a very serious issue to address today. Last night's bonfire event was a disaster, a disgrace to our community, and it was all due to a deliberate act of vandalism." A few scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Margaret ignored them, pressing on. "Someone," she continued, her eyes scanning the room, lingering on me for a second too long, intentionally tampered with the firewood. That person put hazardous, insect-infested logs into the pile, causing chaos, injury, and reputational damage to the HOA. This is an attack on our very way of life, and I demand that the responsible party be held accountable." She paused for dramatic effect, expecting a wave of agreement. Instead, the room remained awkwardly silent. A few people exchanged glances, and then, from the back, someone snickered. Margaret's jaw tightened. Beatrice, the HOA vice president, finally spoke up, her voice slow and measured. "Margaret, before we start throwing around accusations, maybe we should discuss the real issue here. Like how the firewood got there in the first place." Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone suddenly defensive. Beatrice leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you take that firewood from Daniel's property without his permission?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Margaret's face twitched, but she forced out a laugh. "Oh, please. It was for the benefit of the community. His firewood was in violation of aesthetic standards." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "You mean the same aesthetic standards that don't actually exist in the HOA guidelines?" Margaret stiffened, her carefully constructed argument crumbling. "I was acting in the best interest of—" Another voice cut in, this time from old Mr. Thompson, one of the longest-standing residents. "Margaret, you stole that man's firewood. Then you threw it into the bonfire in front of the whole neighborhood, and now you're mad because it backfired on you. Sounds like karma to me." Laughter erupted, louder this time. Margaret's face flushed deep red, her composure slipping by the second. She had spent years bullying people, twisting rules to suit her needs, acting as if she was above everyone else. But now, the spell was broken. People weren't afraid of her anymore. They were openly mocking her, questioning her authority, and she knew it. "I move to have a vote," Beatrice announced, cutting through the noise. "A vote to remove Margaret from her position as HOA president." The room went silent for a moment, then erupted into a flurry of voices. People were nodding, whispering in agreement, while Margaret's face twisted in horror. "You can't be serious," she sputtered, rising to her feet. "I have dedicated years to this community. I have made sacrifices. You stole firewood, ruined the bonfire, and nearly started a neighborhood riot," someone called from the back. "You fined people for having garden gnomes," another added. "You wrote me up for leaving my porch light on too late," a woman chimed in. "You banned lemonade stands," a kid shouted. And that was the final straw. The room erupted in boos, people shaking their heads, laughing, calling for the vote to be taken immediately. Beatrice, barely containing her smile, stood up. All in favor of removing Margaret from her position. Hands shot up across the room. More than half, more than enough. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned to the crowd, desperate, trying to salvage her last shred of control. "You're making a mistake. You need me. This community needs me." But nobody was listening. The vote had been cast. It was over. Margaret let out an inhuman noise, a mixture of frustration and disbelief, and stormed out of the community center. The moment the doors slammed shut behind her, the room erupted into cheers. That night, I sat on my porch, a fresh pile of legally owned firewood stacked beside me. The air was crisp, the sky clear, the kind of perfect evening for a small, personal bonfire. As I watched the flames flicker and dance, a few neighbors stopped by, laughing, sharing a drink, reveling in the victory of the day. Margaret's reign was over. The HOA was free. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood actually felt like a community again. I raised my cup of hot cider, smiling to myself. "Here's to justice," I murmured, tossing another log into the fire. and for once, I could enjoy it in peace. The days following Margaret's humiliating exit from the HOA presidency were filled with a strange mix of relief and unease. The neighborhood, for the first time in years, felt like a community again. People waved to each other as they passed by, stopped to chat on the sidewalks, and even organized impromptu gatherings. The oppressive cloud of Margaret's micromanagement had lifted, and everyone seemed to breathe a little easier. But as the initial euphoria faded, a new reality began to set in. The HOA, now leaderless, was in disarray. Beatrice, the vice president, had stepped in as interim president, but she was more of a caretaker than a leader. She lacked Margaret's iron-fisted determination, and while that was a relief to most, it also meant that decisions were slow to be made, and disputes began to simmer beneath the surface. For me, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. I enjoyed my evenings by the fire, savoring the quiet and the warmth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's absence was too good to last. She wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she resurfaced. 2 weeks after the bonfire incident, I was in my backyard, stacking a fresh load of firewood, when I heard the unmistakable sound of Margaret's voice. It was sharp, commanding, and carried the same self-righteous tone that had grated on everyone's nerves for years. I froze, my hands gripping a log tightly, and turned toward the source of the noise. There she was, standing at the edge of my property, flanked by 2 unfamiliar men in suits. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her hair perfectly styled, her posture rigid. But there was something different about her, a cold, calculating glint in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Daniel," she called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A word, if you don't mind." I set the log down and walked over, my guard up. "Margaret, to what do I owe the pleasure?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll cut to the chase. I've been doing some thinking, and I've come to the conclusion that what happened at the bonfire was unfortunate. But it's also given me a new perspective. I realize now that I may have been too harsh in my approach to leadership." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Is that so?" She nodded, her expression softening in a way that almost seemed genuine. "Yes, I've decided to run for HOA president again. But this time, I want to do things differently. I want to work with the community, not against it." I couldn't help but laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. After everything you've done, you think people are just going to welcome you back with open arms?" Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. "People make mistakes, Daniel. I'm willing to admit mine and move forward. And I think the neighborhood deserves a leader who knows how to get things done." I crossed my arms, studying her carefully. "And what about the firewood? The fines? The constant harassment? Are you just going to sweep all of that under the rug?" She waved a hand dismissively. "Water under the bridge. What's important now is the future, and I believe I'm the best person to lead us into it." I shook my head, incredulous. "You're unbelievable, you know that? You think you can just waltz back in here and pretend nothing happened? People haven't forgotten, Margaret. They're not going to forgive you that easily." Her smile returned, but this time it was laced with something darker. "We'll see about that." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, the 2 men following closely behind. I watched her go, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. Margaret wasn't just back. She was planning something. And whatever it was, I knew it wouldn't be good. True to her word, Margaret launched her campaign for HOA president the very next day. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, touting her as a reformed leader who had learned from her mistakes. She even organized a neighborhood meeting, promising to listen to everyone's concerns and work together to create a better, stronger community. To my surprise, some people actually bought into it. Margaret was a master manipulator, and she knew exactly how to play on people's emotions. She apologized profusely at the meeting, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine remorse. She promised to be more transparent, to involve the community in decision-making, and to focus on what really mattered: safety, unity, and pride in our neighborhood. By the end of the meeting, a small but vocal group of residents had rallied behind her. They saw her as a strong leader who had made mistakes but was willing to change. Others, however, remained skeptical. They remembered the years of fines, the arbitrary rules, and the constant fear of crossing her. The neighborhood was divided, and tensions began to rise. As the campaign heated up, strange things started happening around the neighborhood. One morning, I woke up to find my mailbox vandalized, the word traitor spray painted across it in bold red letters. A few days later, someone slashed the tires on Beatrice's car. Then, a series of anonymous letters began circulating, accusing me of sabotaging the bonfire and trying to destroy the HOA. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it all. Margaret was playing dirty, using fear and intimidation to silence her critics and rally support. But without proof, there was nothing we could do. Beatrice called an emergency HOA meeting to address the escalating tensions. The room was packed, the air thick with anger and suspicion. People shouted over each other, accusations flying in every direction. Margaret sat quietly in the corner, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "This has to stop," Beatrice shouted, banging her gavel on the table. "We're a community, not a battlefield. If anyone has information about who's behind these attacks, now is the time to speak up." The room fell silent, everyone glancing around nervously. Finally, I stood up. "We all know who's behind this," I said, my voice steady. "Margaret's trying to divide us so she can take control again. But we can't let her. We have to stand together." Margaret stood up, her expression one of wounded innocence. "Daniel, I understand why you're upset, but these accusations are baseless. I'm just trying to help." "Help?" I shot back. "By vandalizing property? By spreading lies? That's not help, Margaret. That's manipulation." The room erupted into chaos, people shouting and arguing. Beatrice tried to restore order, but it was no use. The meeting ended in disarray, with no resolution in sight. As the election day approached, the neighborhood became a powder keg waiting to explode. Margaret's supporters grew more vocal, while her opponents dug in their heels. I knew we couldn't let her win. If she regained power, it would be a disaster for everyone. The night before the election, I gathered a small group of neighbors at my house. We sat around the fire, brainstorming ways to counter Margaret's campaign. It was then that old Mr. Thompson spoke up. "We need to hit her where it hurts," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Her reputation. If we can show people who she really is, they'll never vote for her." "And how do we do that?" I asked. He leaned forward, a sly grin spreading across his face. "We set a trap. The plan was simple but risky. We would stage a fake HOA event, inviting Margaret to speak as the guest of honor. But instead of praising her, we would expose her true colors in front of the entire neighborhood." The event was set for the evening of the election. We spread the word quietly, making sure Margaret's supporters were in attendance. When the time came, the community center was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Margaret took the stage, her usual confident smile in place. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I'm so grateful for your support and your belief in me. Together, we can make this neighborhood the best it can be." As she spoke, I stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. "Actually, Margaret, there's something we need to discuss." She frowned, her smile faltering. "Daniel, this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it is," I interrupted. "You see, we've been doing some digging, and we found some interesting things about your so-called reform." I handed the documents to Beatrice, who began reading them aloud. They detailed Margaret's secret dealings with contractors, her embezzlement of HOA funds, and her plans to impose even stricter rules if re-elected. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Margaret's face turned pale. "This is ridiculous. Those documents are fake." "Are they?" I asked, holding up a USB drive. "Because we have the receipts." The room fell silent as Beatrice plugged the drive into a laptop and projected the evidence onto a screen. The proof was undeniable. Margaret stood frozen, her mask of innocence slipping away to reveal the cold, calculating woman beneath. "You've been lying to us this whole time," Beatrice said, her voice shaking with anger. "You don't care about this community. You only care about power." Margaret's supporters turned on her, their faces filled with betrayal and anger. She tried to defend herself, but her words were drowned out by the growing chorus of boos and shouts. Finally, she snapped. "Fine," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You want the truth? I do care about power. Because without it, I'm nothing. And none of you would have the guts to do what needs to be done." With that, she stormed off the stage, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The room erupted into chaos, but this time, it was a chaos of relief and triumph. The election was canceled, and Margaret was officially banned from holding any position in the HOA. The neighborhood came together to rebuild, this time with a focus on transparency and cooperation. Beatrice was elected president, and for the first time in years, the HOA felt like it truly represented the community. As for me, I returned to my quiet evenings by the fire, savoring the peace and the knowledge that justice had been served. Margaret's reign of terror was over, and the neighborhood was finally free. But as I sat there, watching the flames dance, I couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end. Margaret was many things, but she wasn't a quitter. And I had a feeling that, somewhere out there, she was already plotting her next move. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.